Every empire was built on a story. His channel investigates the ones that weren't true. England, 1135 AD. King Henry I is dead. He has no legitimate male heir. He has, however, approximately 20 illegitimate ones, none of whom anyone is willing to crown. What he does leave behind is a kingdom, a very large, very wealthy, very unstable kingdom, and two people who both believe, with complete and total conviction, that it belongs to them. On one side, Empress Matilda, daughter of the dead king, legitimate by blood, furious by temperament. On the other, Stephen of Blois, nephew of the dead king, already crowned, already sitting on the throne, already, in Matilda's view, a usurper who needed to be removed from both the throne and, ideally, the earth. What followed was 19 years of civil war. The English called it the Anarchy, not as a political label, not as historical shorthand. They called it that because that is precisely what it was. 19 years. Fields burned, castles razed, crops destroyed 3 seasons in a row. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the closest thing England had to a newspaper, recorded simply that Christ and his saints were asleep. 19 years. For a throne. For a kingdom. For the right to say, I am the chosen one. Here's the part that no one talks about. Both sides had proof. Not just speeches. Not just claims. Both Matilda and Stephen had documented, written, formally presented prophetic evidence that they, specifically they, were destined to rule England. Same document, same prophecies, 2 completely opposite conclusions. And here's the part that should keep you up at night. Both of them were right, in the sense that the text genuinely supported both interpretations. Not because the prophecies were sophisticated or divinely inspired, but because they were written to be interpreted any way you needed them to be, by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. His name was Geoffrey of Monmouth. He was a monk, an academic, a man of God. Presumably, though the historical record on that last point is, let's say, complicated. In 1136, he published what he claimed was a comprehensive history of the kings of Britain, from the very first legendary monarch all the way to the 7th century AD. 1,000 years of history, carefully documented, meticulously sourced, based on, he claimed, an ancient book written in the old British tongue, given to him by a friend, a certain Archdeacon Walter of Oxford. No one else ever saw this book, not one other scholar of the period. Il mentions, quotes it, or references it. It appears in no catalogue, no inventory, no list of any library in medieval Europe. The book that Geoffrey of Monmouth used as the sole source for 1,000 years of British history does not exist. No surviving evidence suggests that such a book ever existed. Many historians now argue that Geoffrey likely knew the source could not be independently verified. To understand what Geoffrey of Monmouth did, you first have to understand what England was in the year 1130. Not what it looked like on a map, what it felt like from the inside. 64 years earlier, in 1066, a Norman duke named William had crossed the English Channel with an army, killed the Anglo-Saxon King Harold at Hastings, and taken the entire country in the space of a single afternoon. The Normans were not subtle conquerors. They did not assimilate. They did not learn the language. They did not pretend to be English. They replaced the Anglo-Saxon nobility almost entirely, confiscating land, redistributing titles, installing their own men in every position of religious, military, and administrative power. Within a generation, the ruling class of England spoke French, prayed in Latin, and regarded the people they governed with a mixture of efficiency and contempt that only the truly comfortable can manage. For the Anglo-Saxon population, the people who had been English long before the Normans arrived, this was not merely a political change. It was an erasure. Their language was reduced to a peasant tongue. Their laws were rewritten. Their saints were questioned. Their shrines neglected. Their histories treated as folklore by the men who now controlled which histories got written down and which ones got forgotten. What they did not have, what they desperately, viscerally needed, was a past. Not just any past, a glorious one. A past that said, we were here before you. We were great before you. And whatever you have taken from us, you cannot take that. This is important. Remember this, because Geoffrey of Monmouth was about to give it to them. Geoffrey of Monmouth was born sometime around 1095, most likely in or near Monmouth, a small town on the border of Wales in England, which is relevant, as border towns tend to produce people who understand that identity is not a fixed thing. It is a negotiation. We know very little about his early life with any certainty. What we do know is that by the 1120s, he was in Oxford, not yet a university town in any formal sense, but already a place where clergymen gathered, debated, taught, and, critically, had access to books. He was associated with St. George's College, a small community of secular canons, educated men, literate in Latin, connected to the networks of scholarship and ecclesiastical power that ran through medieval England like invisible roads. He was not powerful. He was not wealthy. He was not, as far as anyone can determine, particularly influential. Not yet, but he was paying attention. And what he saw, as he read the histories available to him, the works of Bede, of Gildas, of the sparse Welsh chronicles, was a gap, a very large, very convenient gap. The gap was this. No one had written a complete history of Britain before the Romans. Gildas, writing in the 6th century, covered the Roman period and its aftermath. Bede, in the 8th century, wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people, thorough, authoritative, trusted. But before Rome, before the legions arrived, the kings, the battles, the dynasties that must have existed in the centuries before recorded history began in Britain. Silence. Not because nothing happened, because no one had written it down in a form that survived. Geoffrey saw this silence and made a decision that would shape European political thought for the next 400 years. He decided to fill it somewhere between 1130 and 1136. Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain. It is, by any modern standard of historical analysis, a work of fiction, sophisticated fiction, brilliantly structured fiction, fiction with real place names, real geographical details, real political resonance for every reader who picked it up, but fiction. The book begins with Brutus, a great-grandson of the Trojan hero Aeneas, sailing to Britain and founding a kingdom. It traces an unbroken line of kings, through giants, through Roman conquest, through legendary battles, against peoples and creatures that do not appear in any other historical record. It gives Britain a founding myth, as grand as Rome's, as old as Troy, as legitimate as anything the Normans could claim. And then, approximately 2/3 of the way through this 1,000-year history, Geoffrey introduces a character, a boy born of uncertain parentage, a prophet, a counselor to kings. His name is Merlin. The Prophecies of Merlin occupy a specific section of Historia, a section so distinct, so self-contained, that Geoffrey had actually circulated it as a separate document before the full book was published, which tells you something. It tells you that Geoffrey understood exactly which part of his book people were going to want most. The prophecies themselves are extraordinary texts, not because they are clear, but because they are magnificently, deliberately, professionally unclear. They speak of lions and dragons and eagles, of rivers running with blood, of a kingdom divided and reunited, of a ruler rising from a lineage both ancient and pure. Every sentence is constructed to carry multiple possible meanings. Every image is chosen for its ambiguity, not its precision. This was not an accident. This was engineering. Geoffrey was not writing prophecy. He was writing a political tool that could be picked up by anyone, pointed at any enemy, and used to justify any conclusion, as long as the person wielding it believed, or could convince others to believe, that they were the lion and not the dragon. Same text, two kingdoms, two destinies, both, somehow, inevitably. Geoffrey of Monmouth had written the most successful blank check in the history of medieval politics, and he had barely finished writing it before the cashing began. But before we follow the prophecies out of Oxford and into the courts of kings, we should ask the question that nobody in 1136 thought to ask. How did Geoffrey get away with it? He was not writing in secret. He was not operating in obscurity. Historia Regum Britanniae was dedicated to powerful patrons. Robert of Gloucester, one of the most influential nobles in England, Waleran of Meulan, a major political figure with direct access to the Norman court. These were not men who could be easily deceived. These were not credulous peasants, grasping at legends. These were the most educated, most politically sophisticated men of their generation. And not one of them said, "Wait, where is this ancient Breton book you keep mentioning? Can we see it?" The answer to that question tells us something deeply uncomfortable about how misinformation works, not just in the 12th century, but in every century that follows. Nobody asked, because nobody wanted to. Robert of Gloucester was Empress Matilda's half-brother and most powerful supporter. A history that gave Britain a glorious founding myth, a history that could be used to legitimize almost any royal claim, was extraordinarily useful to him. Waleran of Meulan was navigating the dangerous politics of a kingdom about to fracture, a text that powerful men were already treating as authoritative, was something you wanted to be associated with, not something you wanted to challenge. And beyond the patrons, across the whole of literate England, across France, across the courts of Europe, were copies of Historia were already beginning to circulate. The book was doing something that no dry chronicle of actual events had ever managed to do. It was making people feel something. It was giving the English a mythology equal to Rome's, a lineage as old as Troy, a prophet whose words could reach forward through time and touch the present moment and say, This was always going to happen. You were always going to be here. You were chosen. Within 10 years of publication, Historia Regum Britanniae had been copied and distributed across England, France, and the Rhineland. Within 50 years, it existed in more manuscript copies than almost any other historical text of the medieval period. Modern scholars have identified over 200 surviving copies, a number that represents, at best, a fraction of how many originally existed. To put that in context, most genuinely important historical texts from the same period survive in 5 to 20 copies. Some survive in 1. Some don't survive at all. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Book of Invented History survived in over 200 copies because people wanted it to survive, because they were copying it, protecting it, citing it, building on it. Because once a story becomes the story people tell about themselves, once it becomes load-bearing, the question of whether it is true becomes almost beside the point. Almost. There is one more thing about Geoffrey of Monmouth that we need to establish before the prophecies leave Oxford and enter the Wars of Kings in 1139. 3 years after Historia was published, a Welsh scholar named Caradog of Llangollen wrote a continuation of Geoffrey's work. In the same year, a Norman historian named Henry of Huntingdon encountered a copy of Historia at the Abbey of Bec in Normandy and wrote, in visible astonishment, to a colleague about this text that nobody had mentioned before. He was not astonished by its quality. He was astonished that something so significant, covering so much history, had apparently existed for years without any of the scholars he knew being aware of it. He did not say it was false. He said it was surprising. There is a difference. And in that difference, in that gap between I haven't seen the source and therefore the source does not exist, Geoffrey of Monmouth built an entire alternative history of Britain. He lived in that gap. He worked in that gap. He understood that in a world where knowledge moved slowly and could not be instantly verified, the gap was not a vulnerability. It was a strategy. The prophecies were written in Oxford, but Oxford was never going to be where they did their damage. In the year 1136, Historia Regum Britanniae existed in exactly 1 copy, the one Geoffrey of Monmouth had just finished writing. By 1150, 14 years later, it was everywhere. Not everywhere the way information moves now. In seconds. Across continents. With no friction and no delay. Everywhere the way things moved in the 12th century. By hand. By horse. By the slow and deliberate network of monasteries, cathedral schools, and royal courts that constituted the nervous system of medieval European knowledge. Monks copied it. Abbots lent it. Nobles commissioned their own versions, some with illustrations, some with additional commentary, some with small but telling modifications that quietly adjusted a prophecy here, emphasized a lineage there, to better suit the political needs of whoever was paying for the copy. Over 200 manuscript copies survive today. Scholars estimate the original number was several times that. For comparison, the genuinely foundational historical texts of the same period, Bede's ecclesiastical history, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, survive in far fewer copies. Geoffrey's invented history outlasted the real ones, because people wanted it, because people needed it, because once it was in circulation, it stopped being a book and became something else entirely. It became a fact. Let us be precise about the timeline. 1136, Historia is published. Geoffrey dedicates it to Robert of Gloucester and Waleran of Meulan, both of whom are already deeply embedded in the political crisis unfolding around the English throne. 1138, Stephen of Blois, who has been king for 2 years and is already facing serious challenge, begins consolidating his claim through every available means: military, legal, ecclesiastical, and prophetic. Chroniclers close to Stephen's court begin citing the prophecies of Merlin in correspondence and formal documents, identifying Stephen as the figure the prophecies describe as rightfully ascending to a kingdom divided. Etusen etundra recornio. Empress Matilda lands in England with an army and her own set of justifications. Her supporters, too, cite Geoffrey's prophecies, specifically the passages about a ruler of ancient and legitimate lineage, reclaiming what was wrongfully taken. Same passage, different rulers, the same words doing opposite work in the hands of opposite factions. To understand how this was possible, how the same text could support two completely contradictory claims, you need to understand how Geoffrey wrote his prophecies. Because he was not careless. He was not vague by accident. He was vague by design, with the precision of a craftsman who understands exactly what their material needs to do. Take one of the most frequently cited passages from the Prophecies of Merlin, the one both factions used most aggressively during the Civil War years. In Latin, it reads as follows, and I am giving you the literal translation, so you can see the mechanism at work. The Lion of Justice shall succeed, at whose roar the towers of Gaul shall shake, and the island dragons tremble. That is the whole prophecy. 12 words in translation. No dates. No names. No geographical specificity beyond Gaul, which in 12th century usage could refer to France, to Normandy, or to the French-speaking Norman aristocracy already ruling England. The Lion of Justice. Ask yourself, who is that? If you are a supporter of Stephen of Blois, a king who has been on the throne for 3 years, who has been fighting to maintain order in a kingdom sliding toward chaos, the Lion of Justice is obviously Stephen. He is the established ruler. He is the law. He is the lion. If you are a supporter of Empress Matilda, the legitimate heir by blood, fighting to reclaim a throne that was stolen from her by a usurper, the Lion of Justice is obviously Matilda. She is the one restoring the right order. She is justice itself. She is the lion. Neither reading is wrong. Neither reading is right. The prophecy was engineered to produce exactly this result. The civil war known as the Anarchy lasted from 1138 to 1153. 15 years. During those 15 years, the prophecies of Merlin were cited in at least a dozen major political documents, formal letters, ecclesiastical pronouncements, and the kind of carefully worded, semi-official correspondence through which medieval politics actually operated. We know this because historians John Gillingham and Leslie Coote have traced the documentary record with considerable care, and what that record shows is not a few enthusiastic amateurs grasping at legend. It shows a systematic, deliberate deployment of Geoffrey's prophecies as a legitimate form of political evidence. Bishops cited them in sermons. Lawyers used them in correspondence about rights and succession. Nobles had them copied into the preambles of land grants, as though a prophecy from Merlin could serve the same legal function as a royal charter. In the 12th century, it could, because in a world where authority came from God, and God communicated through prophets, a sufficiently ancient and sufficiently mysterious prophetic text, carried genuine legal and moral weight. Geoffrey had not just written a history, he had manufactured a form of authority. Now we come to the third king, because the anarchy did not end with Stephen defeating Matilda, or Matilda defeating Stephen. It ended with a deal. In 1153, the Treaty of Wallingford established that Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, and that upon his death, the throne would pass to Matilda's son Henry. Stephen died the following year. Henry of Anjou became Henry II of England in 1154. He was 21 years old. He was the most powerful monarch England had seen in a generation. And he had a problem. His claim to the throne was legitimate enough. He was the grandson of Henry V, son of the rightful heir, but he had come to power through compromise. Is not a conquest, through a treaty, not a triumph, in a political culture where the manner of your accession was almost as important as the fact of it, where kings were expected to be chosen, not merely inherited. Henry needed a better story. He needed to be inevitable. He needed, in other words, a prophecy. Here is where Geoffrey's masterwork reveals its full engineering. Henry II did not just cite the prophecies. He commissioned a reinterpretation of them. In the late 1150s, a scholar at the English court, working with the patronage and, presumably, the implicit direction of the royal administration, produced a new Latin commentary on the Prophecies of Merlin. This commentary did not change the prophecies. It could not. They were too well known by now, copied in too many manuscripts, read by too many people. What it did was far more sophisticated. It provided an authoritative reading, a definitive gloss that directed the reader toward the correct interpretation of each passage. And in this correct interpretation, every prophecy that had previously been used to support Stephen or to support Matilda was now revealed to have always, actually, obviously, pointed toward Henry, the lion of justice, Henry, the eagle of the broken covenant, Henry's enemies, the river that would rise and flood the kingdom, the chaos of the anarchy itself, which Henry had ended. The prophecies had not changed. The meaning had, and because Geoffrey had written them with such magnificent ambiguity, the new meaning was just as supportable as all the previous ones. Same words. Third conclusion. Third king. Geoffrey of Monmouth had been dead for less than a year when this happened. There is no record of his reaction. At this point, a reasonable person might ask, didn't anyone notice? Not that the prophecies were invented. That question would not be seriously pursued for another 4 centuries. But didn't anyone notice that the same text kept producing different results for different people? Didn't anyone notice that every king who needed a prophecy happened to find one in Geoffrey's pages? The answer, documented in the chronicles of the period, is instructive. Some people noticed. Some people said so. And what happened to them tells us everything we need to know about how misinformation protects itself once it is established. The most prominent critic of Geoffrey's work in the 12th century was a Yorkshire canon named William of Newburgh. Writing around 1190, 50 years after Historia was published, William devoted the entire preface of his own historical work to dismantling Geoffrey's. He was methodical. He was precise. He was, by the standards of his time, remarkably rigorous. He pointed out that Geoffrey described events and figures that no other British or Roman source mentions. He pointed out that Geoffrey's account of the Roman occupation of Britain directly contradicts the actual Roman historical record. He pointed out that the sheer scale of the kings and armies and battles Geoffrey describes would have been impossible to miss in the real historical record if they had actually happened. He called Historia, in the measured language of 12th century scholarship, mendacious, a sustained and deliberate fiction. He was right. He was completely, demonstrably right. Modern scholarship has confirmed every single criticism he made, and it made absolutely no difference. William of Newburgh's critique survived in a small number of copies. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia survived in over 200. This is not a coincidence. This is not an accident of history. This is the mechanism. Once a story becomes structurally necessary, once it is load-bearing in the sense that powerful institutions, legal frameworks, and national identities are resting their weight on it, the truth about the story becomes not just inconvenient, but genuinely dangerous. To accept William of Newburgh's argument was to accept that the last 50 years of English political history, the wars, the treaties, the legitimate kings, had been conducted partly on the basis of a fiction, that the prophecies cited in royal documents were invented, that the authority derived from those prophecies was therefore illegitimate, that the kingdoms built on that authority were, in a very specific sense, built on nothing. No king wants to hear that. No bishop wants to preach it. No lawyer wants to argue it in court. So they didn't. William of Newburgh was right, and he was right alone, and the world continued without him. The Anarchy ended in 1153. The prophecies did not. They were still being cited in political documents 100 years after Geoffrey wrote them. 200 years. 300. The last documented use of the Prophecies of Merlin as a serious political argument in English royal politics occurred in the 14th century, when King Edward I of England used them to justify his claim to sovereignty over Scotland. Geoffrey of Monmouth died in 1155. His prophecies outlived him by 250 years. At minimum, let us return to the question we set aside at the end of Hoy 1. The question that, in the 12th century, almost no one asked. Did Geoffrey of Monmouth know that what he was writing was not true? This is not a trivial question. It sounds simple, almost insulting in its simplicity, but it sits at the absolute center of everything this episode has been building toward, because the answer changes everything. If Geoffrey genuinely believed he was recording real history, if the ancient Breton book existed, if the sources were real, if he was simply a historian, working with the materials available to him, then what he did is a story about the limits of knowledge, a story about how false things enter the historical record through honest error. That is an interesting story, but it is not the story we are telling today. The scholarly consensus on Geoffrey of Monmouth has shifted considerably over the past century. In the 19th and early 20th century, historians largely treated him as a well-meaning but credulous compiler, someone who gathered genuine oral traditions and local legends, mixed them with whatever written sources he could find, and produced something that was, by modern standards, unreliable, but by his own standards, a genuine attempt at history. This view had a certain comfort to it. It made Geoffrey a victim of his limitations, rather than an architect of deception. It did not survive contact with the evidence. The scholars who dismantled the charitable reading of Geoffrey's work did so carefully, and over time, and with the kind of methodological precision that Geoffrey himself conspicuously lacked. Julia Crick, whose 4-volume study of the manuscript tradition of Historia Regum Britanniae remains the definitive work on the subject, documented in exhaustive detail the way Geoffrey constructed his text, the sources he used, the sources he claimed to use, and the very significant gap between them. Michael Faletra, working from a post-colonial framework, analyzed how Geoffrey's text functions not as history, but as what Faletra calls colonial mythology, a narrative designed to serve the legitimation needs of a specific political moment. Valerie Flint, in her influential 1979 analysis, made the case most directly. Geoffrey was not a bad historian. He was not a credulous one. He was a skilled writer who understood his audience, understood their needs, understood what kind of text would spread and be believed, and wrote exactly that text, with intent, with precision, with, Flint argues, a clear-eyed understanding of what he was producing and why. Here is the evidence that makes the charitable reading impossible to sustain. First, the ancient Breton book. Geoffrey mentions this source, a very old book in the British tongue, exactly twice in Historia, once at the beginning, to establish its existence, once at the end, to thank the man who gave it to him. He never quotes from it directly. He never cites a specific passage. He never describes its physical characteristics, its length, its condition, its age, the monastery where it was kept. He never explains why. In a culture where books were enormously valuable and carefully catalogued, this particular book left no trace in any other record. No contemporary of Geoffrey's ever mentions having seen this book. The one person who might have confirmed its existence, Archdeacon Walter of Oxford. The man Geoffrey says gave it to him was a real person. Walter of Oxford existed. He was a well-documented figure in the ecclesiastical records of the period. He never, in any surviving document, mentions owning or lending in nonsense Breton manuscript to Geoffrey of Monmouth. Not once. The book does not exist because Geoffrey did not need it to exist. He needed it to have existed, past tense. Comfortably unverifiable, conveniently unavailable for inspection. He needed a source. He did not need anyone to actually find it. Second, the internal consistency problem. Historia Regum Britanniae describes a Britain of enormous kingdoms, vast armies, extensive trade networks, and continuous dynastic succession spanning nearly 1,000 years. These things would have left traces, not just in chronicles, in archaeology, in place names, in the material record that survives, even when documents don't. The Roman historians who actually occupied Britain for 4 centuries, Caesar, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, describe a very different island. Tribal, fragmented, periodically powerful in localized ways, but nothing resembling the unified, glorious, classically organized kingdom that Geoffrey describes. The discrepancies are not minor. They are total. Geoffrey's pre-Roman Britain and the actual pre-Roman Britain documented by the Romans who were there are not 2 different versions of the same history. They are 2 different countries. One of them is real. William of Newburgh spotted this in 1190. Modern archaeology has confirmed it, with a century of fieldwork. There is no evidence. None. Not a shard. Not a coin. Not a place name. for the kingdoms Geoffrey describes, because those kingdoms never existed. Third, and this is the evidence that Valerie Flint finds most compelling, the prophecies themselves. Specifically, the timing. The Prophecies of Merlin were circulated by Geoffrey as a standalone document before Historia was published. He dedicated this standalone version to Alexander, Bishop of Lincoln, one of the most politically powerful churchmen in England at the time. Think about what that means. If you are a scholar who believes you have discovered a genuine ancient prophetic text, a real artifact of ancient wisdom, you do not send it, as your first act, to the most politically connected bishop you can access. You verify it. You study it. You establish its authenticity through the scholarly mechanisms available to you. If you are a scholar who has written a politically useful document and wants it to enter circulation at the highest possible level, you send it to the most politically connected bishop you can access. Geoffrey sent it to the bishop first, before anything else, before the full Historia was published, before any scholarly context was established. He knew what the text was for. He knew who needed to see it. He knew exactly what he had made. So we return to the question, did Geoffrey know? He knew, not in the way that makes him un simple fraud, a cynical man manufacturing lies for personal gain. The evidence does not support that reading either. Geoffrey of Monmouth was not cynical. He may not have been cynical. That's what makes him more dangerous. He was a man who believed that the story he was telling was more true than the truth. Let that sit for a moment. More true than the truth. Not more accurate. Not more factually correct. More true in the sense that mattered, in the sense that it gave people something real to hold on to. Something that answered a need that the actual historical record could not answer. England in 1836 needed a mythology. The Anglo-Saxon population needed ancestors as grand as the Normans. The Norman rulers needed a legitimizing narrative that connected their conquest to something older and more sacred than the outcome of a single battle. Geoffrey gave them all of that, and he appears to have believed, genuinely, not cynically, that a nation with a good mythology was better than a nation without one, even if the mythology had to be made. Especially, perhaps, if it had to be made. This is what makes Geoffrey of Monmouth not a footnote in the history of fraud, but a central figure in the history of how human beings construct their relationship to the past. He understood something, and we are still, in the 21st century, struggling to articulate clearly that narrative truth and factual truth are not the same thing, and that in a contest between a story that feels true and a document that proves it isn't, the story wins. Almost every time. Almost everywhere. Not because people are stupid. Not because the people who believe Geoffrey were less intelligent than we are. The bishops who cited his prophecies were among the most educated people in the world at that time. The kings who built their legitimacy on his text had access to every form of knowledge that existed in their era. They believed Geoffrey because believing Geoffrey was more useful than not believing him, because the cost of disbelief was too high, and because Geoffrey had understood this before he wrote a single word. Geoffrey of Monmouth was appointed Bishop of St. Asaph in Wales in 1151. He had spent 15 years watching his book reshape the political landscape of England. He had watched kings cite his prophecies. He had watched armies march under the banner of his invented mythology. He had watched the story he created become, in the most literal possible sense, the story England told about itself. And if he felt any discomfort about this, any private reckoning with the gap between what he had written and what was true, there is no record of it. Not a single surviving document shows Geoffrey expressing doubt or regret or the kind of retrospective anxiety we might expect from someone who watched their invented history help justify 19 years of civil war. What we have instead is the record of a man who continued to write, continued to build on his mythology, continued to be rewarded by the same institutions that had benefited from his work. He was made a bishop. He was, by every indication, content. The willing architect did not tear down what he built. He lived in it. Geoffrey of Monmouth died in 1155. He was approximately 60 years old. His Historia Regum Britanniae had been in circulation for 19 years. In those 19 years, it had been copied hundreds of times, translated into French and Welsh, used in royal documents, cited in ecclesiastical arguments, and woven so deeply into the political and cultural fabric of England that it was effectively impossible to remove, not because it was hidden, not because it was protected by law, but because it had become load-bearing. The mythology of Arthur and Merlin, Geoffrey's mythology, the one he invented, the one that had no basis in any verifiable historical source, had become the story England told about itself, and the story a nation tells about itself is the last thing it surrenders. Here is what we know, with certainty, about the prophecies of Merlin. They were written in Oxford between 1130 and 1136 by a man named Geoffrey of Monmouth. They were based on no ancient source. They referenced no real prophetic tradition. They describe no genuine historical figures beyond the names Geoffrey borrowed from the thin documentary record available to him. They were, in the technical sense, a fabrication, and they were used to justify the civil war between Stephen and Matilda, 19 years of civil war, widespread devastation, and the death toll historians still debate. The coronation of Henry II, framed as the prophesied resolution of England's division. Edward II's claim to sovereignty over Scotland, cited directly in royal documents in the 1290s and early 1300s. The broader mythology of Arthurian Britain, which shaped English national identity for 500 years, and which echoes, in ways both obvious and subtle, to the present day. A monk in Oxford wrote 12 ambiguous words about a lion of justice. Wars were fought over who the lion was. Kingdoms were built on the answer. And the man who wrote those words, who understood what he was doing, who chose ambiguity with the precision of a surgeon, died a bishop, comfortable, rewarded, remembered fondly. The willing architect always gets to live in the building. It's the people inside who have to deal with the foundations. We do not know what Geoffrey of Monmouth thought about. In the years after Historia, we do not know if he watched the Anarchy and felt anything specific about his role in it. We do not know if he believed, at the end, that what he had done was worth what it had cost. We have the book, we have the copies, we have the wars, and we have one sentence from his own introduction, written in 1136, before any of the consequences arrived, in which he explains why he decided to fill the silence in the historical record. He says, simply, that he was astonished no one had done it before him. I was astonished. He writes that in the absence of any written record, These kings were lost to memory. Not that the record was false, not that the kings had not existed, just that they were lost, and that he, Geoffrey of Monmouth, had found them. Whether they had ever been there or not is a question he does not ask. Before we leave Geoffrey of Monmouth, there is one more thing to establish. Not about him specifically, about the mechanism, because the mechanism is the point. Geoffrey of Monmouth was not a unique genius of deception. He was not, in the technical sense, even particularly original. What he did, the construction of a false, authoritative source, the deliberate engineering of ambiguity, the targeting of a specific emotional need in a specific audience, the rapid distribution through the most trusted networks available, is a sequence of steps, a procedure. It has a beginning and a middle and an end. It has predictable failure modes and predictable success conditions. It can be learned. It can be repeated. It has been repeated endlessly, in every century, in every language, on every medium that human beings have ever used to move information from one person to another. Let us be specific about the steps, because specificity is the only honest response to a subject like this. Step 1. Identify a gap. Not just any gap. A gap that corresponds to something people need. A missing legitimacy. A missing history. A missing enemy to explain why things have gone wrong. A missing destiny to explain why things are about to go right. Geoffrey's gap was the pre-Roman history of Britain. But the gap can be anything. It can be the origin of a disease. It can be the loyalty of a political figure. It can be the intent behind a policy. It can be the identity of an enemy. The gap is not important in itself. What is important is that it exists, and that people feel its absence. Geoffrey understood this intuitively. The most effective practitioners of this technique in every era have understood it. The gap is not where you start. The gap is what you start with. Step 2. Fill the gap with something that cannot be immediately disproved. This is the technical heart of the operation. This is where the craft lives. Geoffrey could not fill his gap with something obviously false. He could not claim, for instance, that there were no Anglo-Saxons and that Normans had always ruled Britain. Anyone could disprove that. He filled it with something, set far enough in the past, that the absence of contradicting evidence could be explained as the natural result of time. Things get lost. Books burn. Memories fade. A claim about events 1,000 years in the past is much harder to disprove than a claim about events 100 years in the past. And the harder something is to disprove, the more the burden of proof shifts in the minds of most people, from the person making the claim to the person challenging it. Geoffrey did not have to prove that his ancient Breton book existed. His critics had to prove that it didn't. And in a world before systematic archival research, before carbon dating, before the kind of cross-referencing that modern scholarship makes possible, that was nearly impossible, he timed his lie perfectly. Not too recent, not too ancient, just distant enough to be safe. Step 3. Make the gap-filling story emotionally necessary. This is the step that Geoffrey executed with the most genuine brilliance. He did not write a legal document. He did not write a dry chronicle. He wrote a story with heroes and villains, with a founding myth as grand as Rome's, with a prophet whose words reached across centuries to touch the present moment. He wrote something people wanted to read, something that made them feel the way mythology is supposed to make you feel, larger than yourself. connected to something ancient and significant, part of a story that was already underway before you were born and would continue after you were gone. This matters more than anything else in the mechanism, because factual information and emotionally resonant narrative are not competing on equal ground. They never have been. A well-told story activates different neural pathways than a well-documented fact. It produces different chemicals. It creates different memories. It generates different loyalty. Geoffrey knew this the way a craftsman knows his material, not theoretically, but in his hands. He knew that the story he was telling would lodge differently in the mind than a chronicle would be harder to dislodge, would be defended more fiercely, would be copied more than 200 times. Step 4. Distribute through trusted networks. Geoffrey did not publish in the modern sense. He could not. What he did instead was seed his text into the highest trust distribution networks available to him. He dedicated the Prophecies of Merlin to a bishop. He dedicated the full Historia to the most powerful noble in England and to one of the most connected political figures in Normandy. He ensured that the first people to receive and read his text were people whose endorsement, whose mere possession of the text would function as a signal to everyone else that this was a document worth taking seriously. He did not ask them to verify it. He did not give them time to verify it before it was already in the hands of the next person, and the next, and the next. By the time anyone might have thought to ask hard questions, the text was already established, already cited, already part of the conversation that powerful people were having about very important things. To challenge it at that point was not just to challenge a book, it was to challenge the judgment of every person who had already accepted it, which is a much harder thing to do. Step 5, and this is the one that ensures the mechanism survives, even when the original deception is eventually exposed. Make the story load-bearing. Attach it to something people cannot afford to lose. Geoffrey attached his mythology to English national identity, to royal legitimacy, to the legal foundations of land ownership, to the self-image of an entire people. When William of Newburgh correctly identified Historia as fiction, he was not just saying, "This book contains inaccuracies." He was saying, implicitly, the national mythology you have built for the last 50 years is based on nothing. The prophecies your kings cited to justify their woes were manufactured by a monk in Oxford. The ancient history of glorious Britain that you have used to counter Norman claims of superiority does not exist. You have been lied to, and you chose to be lied to, and you are still choosing it right now by not engaging seriously with what I am telling you. William of Newburgh was right, and he was saying something that was impossible to act on, not because people couldn't understand it, because they could. Because they understood perfectly what accepting it would cost. And they decided the cost was too high. They chose the story, not out of stupidity, out of something much more recognizable than stupidity, out of the entirely rational calculation that some losses are too large to absorb. We began this episode with a dead king and a disputed throne, and 19 years of civil war. We ended here, not with Geoffrey, not with the medieval world that made Geoffrey possible. We ended with the mechanism itself, because the mechanism is what this channel exists to document. The gap, the unfalsifiable source, the emotionally necessary story, the trusted distribution network, the load-bearing mythology. 5 steps. Repeatable, scalable, compatible with any medium. Any culture, any century. Geoffrey of Monmouth used parchment and quills. The network was monasteries and royal courts. The distribution took years. The verification was nearly impossible. None of those specifics are true anymore. But the 5 steps are. Every single one of them. And here is the thing that should interest you most. The thing that keeps historians and psychologists and political scientists and, increasingly, technologists up at night. The mechanism does not require a Geoffrey of Monmouth. It does not require intent. It does not require a single architect, willing or otherwise. Once a story is load-bearing, once it is attached to identity, to legitimacy, to the things people cannot afford to lose, it perpetuates itself. People defend it without being asked. People fill in its gaps without instruction. People attack the people who question it without needing to be organized. Geoffrey started it. But Geoffrey could have died the day after he finished writing, and the outcome would have been essentially the same. The story didn't need him anymore. It only needed someone to believe it. Geoffrey of Monmouth died in 1155. He was a bishop. He was respected. He was, in the estimation of his contemporaries, a significant figure in the intellectual life of his time. He left behind a mythology that is still running. King Arthur, Merlin, Camelot, the prophecy of a king who will return when his kingdom needs him most. These are Geoffreys, all of them, invented in Oxford, between 1130 and 1136, by a man with a quill and a clear understanding of what people need from a story. Not truth. Something better than truth. Something that truth, on its own, has never quite managed to be. A reason. I was astonished that in the absence of any written record, these kings were lost to memory. Geoffrey of Monmouth, Historia Regum Britanniae. Say, Etienne Ibai Sanchaleu. Next episode, the donation of Constantine, a document that never existed, governed Europe for 700 years.